The Future of Teamwork is a Leader production. Subscribe today and never miss an episode.
Because we associate visibility with value, meetings become a status symbol. I find especially when there is that lack of clarity in our organizations, people resort to meetings to show progress, show productivity, regardless of whether anything happens in the meetings. I think that's at the root of so much of our dysfunction.
Welcome to the Future of Teamwork podcast. My name's Dane Groeneveld, and today I'm joined by Rebecca Hinds. Rebecca is the author of the best-selling book, Your Best Meeting Ever. She also has a cool title, Head of the Work AI Institute at Glean. So we've been talking about that a little pre-show. As a tone set, I checked in. I was like, Rebecca, is AI a teammate or a tool? And we're definitely more in the teammate camp. So it's going to be a great conversation for the future of teamwork. And welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting.
Me too. I've been really intrigued by AI, and I'm learning that a lot of other people have been seeing this kind of lift since September. So there's lots all of a sudden that's being picked up, and you and I were talking pre-show about like the psychological elements of like how are humans responding. How did you come to be like doing this work and piecing together from, you know, your roles to the book to what's exciting you right now?
Sure. So I've always been fascinated by organizations and how you design organizations. I was a competitive swimmer growing up and, you know, deeply in the weeds in terms of teamwork in sports and wanted to figure out, okay, what does the analogy look like in organizations? How is it that we can create an organization where everyone is at their best and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? And I did my schooling at Stanford and took amazing classes on organizational behavior and organization design that instilled in me this deep fascination for how do we design great organizations? How do we lead great teams? And ever since then, I've worked with organizations in that capacity to help them understand, okay, in light of all these shifts we're seeing on the horizon, started with, you know, very much hybrid remote work, very quickly evolved to AI. A lot of my PhD, which was back in 2019 era, was focused on AI because I became fascinated by the potential of the technology and also the deeply psychological aspects of it. I was studying these organizations that they started to actually ban the term artificial intelligence or discourage it because they recognized how visceral that reaction can be to something that feels very much like a threat to human intelligence. And that, I think, was the piece where I knew this was going to be a big part of my career for the future. Obviously, I didn't know the extent to which it would be pervasive so quickly, but it was something that I deeply wanted to understand further.
That's so cool. And where did the book fit in there? Was the book sort of, I haven't had the chance to read the book. Was it coming from that sort of AI shift and the way that we can be operating differently, or was it from somewhere else?
It was at the end. You know, there's a big component in the book. The last chapter focused mostly on AI, but it was really my fascination with collaboration and collaboration as something that we as knowledge workers spend 85 to 90% of our time on. It's an activity that has increased more and more, in particular since the turn of the century. 50% or more an increase in terms of how much of our time is spent on this activity that we know very little about. And we're not very good or skilled at measuring the strength of our collaboration within our organizations, across departments, across regions, across offices, vertically, horizontally. And meetings in many ways are the tip of the iceberg in terms of you can walk into a meeting and very quickly get a sense of whether collaboration within that organization is effective or not.
Yeah.
And we all have this visceral negative reaction to meetings in a way that I was passionate about wanting to put together a real solution and not just a series of half-hearted fixes.
The hacks. Yeah. That's neat because, I think about collaboration. We've been doing a little bit of research around that also as we think about what healthy teams are. And often it feels like a glamorous word, and yet, to your point, people are dreading the meetings, or their calendars are full and they're feeling drained at the end of the day, and they don't have time to do their work, or they don't even know what their work should be, which is the worst part.
It's such a great point, and we've done research on this topic, specifically looking at the sentiment around collaboration, and I think we all feel it. We hear the word collaboration, and unlike meetings, it has a very positive sentiment.
Yeah.
We often associate it with teamwork, and because of that, we think that more is better. And that's one of the biggest problems, in particular in the organizations that are quite successful on paper. Often the problem isn't too little collaboration, it's actually too much collaboration, too much collaboration overload.
Yeah, that is interesting. We are seeing that too. And when you think about it, I wonder what, and you may have covered that in the book, I wonder what the essence is that we're excited about when we think about collaboration. You mentioned that we kind of think of it like teamwork, but was there something that you found in a best meeting ever that is like, this is the right definition of good collaboration?
It's a great question. And, I've thought a lot about this over the years. And in particular, the delineation between collaboration and coordination, right? Because collaboration is very much, bi-directional. It is often synchronous. By definition, parts of it are synchronous. And we as humans, we're tribal beings. We like to be part of a tribe. We feel, a fear of missing out when we're not part of that tribe. And I think that's a big reason why when we think about collaboration, we think about togetherness, which is such a core part of who we are, whereas coordination is typically more asynchronous in nature. It's more about the handoffs and the bottlenecks. And we know from decades of organizational design research that we as humans, we suffer from what's sometimes called coordination neglect, which means we underestimate just how much coordination is involved in moving work forward. So we like to be together, we like to talk, we like to sit in meetings, but when it comes to thinking through, okay, piece by piece, what part of this workflow needs to happen in which sequence, we tend to not be so great at that piece.
That's so fascinating. Coordination neglect is a new term for me, but I think I've mastered it.
Yes.
So I'm surprised no one's hit me with that before. It's funny, I've been using a few different cool AI coaches and other things in meetings, note takers, you name it, but I'm just exploring it. And one of the consistent themes that I'm getting back in the feedback is, hey, the meeting started great. We got a lot of people excited about the topic. We got some great contributions. We came up with some great ideas on how we should move forward, but we created zero clarity on what the task is, who owns it, when it's going to get done by, who's going to review it. And that's kind of where it feels like with AI, we're creating more exciting work to do, but we're landing it on a whole bunch of people that don't know if it's theirs to do or not, or how.
I think you're spot on. And that's why, we're seeing AI in many cases maybe drive individual productivity, but as soon as you bring it into a team setting, a group setting, it often tends to create more of that cleanup cost, more of the coordination tax, because we haven't thought about the system. And it's a very natural human tendency, but it's something that we're seeing firsthand. And I worry a lot about, sometimes in the research is called the tragedy of the commons, where when we optimize for ourselves, which is our natural behavior, we can often create more work for other people so that you have a team and organization that doesn't have those same gains that we're having at the individual level.
It's interesting. More work for other people is a good point. That's what it does feel like sometimes. There's one additional dimension that I would add to that, just from my own experiences, which is not only are you creating more work, but you're creating more jagged edges. Because if you, Rebecca, give me a really cool piece of work and you've been able to turn it around pretty quickly. We weren't in the room to do a lot of it, whether using AI or not. And then I take that work, and before I've even read it properly, I throw it into Claude, and I'm like, what do you think Rebecca's saying here? This is my objective. How does it serve my purpose? And I throw a piece of work back at you that's just like shifted more than 50%. Like that I find that really jarring.
It is, and it's so nuanced in the case of AI, because it looks polished, right? It
Yeah.
looks polished. It has this veneer that confuses us and distorts our ability to truly gauge the substance and the quality of the piece. Unlike before, where, if you were handed a piece of work, you could tell with reasonable confidence whether that was high quality or not based on the polish, the look of it rather than the substance. They were, often highly correlated. Now it's the reverse, and you often have this. I talk about meeting debt in the book. We know technical debt is very real within our organization. I think AI debt is very real as well, where you might not catch the lack of substance or the veering off of the original intent in the first, one or two handoffs, but it absolutely becomes, ballooning in its impact over time, over days, months, years.
That is fascinating. I hadn't heard of, I've certainly heard of technical debt, but meeting debt. Tell me a little bit more about meeting debt and even how that differs from AI debt.
Sure. So meeting debt, it's the buildup of recurring meetings on our calendar where we show up, we go through the motions week after week, month after month, and people start to no longer know what the purpose of this meeting is. They know it's not valuable. But because meetings are so social in nature, when we extend a meeting invitation, we feel obliged to reciprocate and accept that meeting invite. Even when we think about the words, on the invite, it's accept, it's reject, it's not just yes or no.
It's heavy language.
It's heavy language. And that is why, we feel this sense of guilt or fear or reluctance to bring meetings off the calendar, whereas we often add them to the calendar with such ease that often you'll get this debt over time. And we all feel it, where we can identify meetings on our calendar where we feel obliged to show up because we showed up last week or last month, and we know they're probably not the best investment of our time.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I've had some experiences with people that have worked in government. And some of the stories that I've heard is, hey, we sit in a lot of meetings, we admire a lot of problems, and then we don't do the work. And actually, it kind of feels good. Probably part of that is the social that you touch on. But how much is there truth in the fact that maybe the system of meeting debt is actually serving individuals because it means that there's less work for them to be accountable for?
I think this is the biggest problem. And when I think there are multiple oodles of problems associated with our meetings, I think at the core of it is visibility bias, the sense of, most work is actually invisible. It's hard to know whether someone's thinking carefully through a problem or rewriting that email for the 11th time to make sure it lands perfectly. But meetings are highly visible. They're the most visible form of work we have. We can often see people's calendars visibly within the organization. We can certainly see people huddled around a conference room or leaning into a Zoom screen. And because we associate visibility with value, meetings become a status symbol, right? There's nothing that says you're more important in the organization as quickly as a packed calendar or being double or triple booked for a meeting. And I find, especially when there is that lack of clarity in our organizations, people resort to meetings to show progress, show productivity, regardless of whether anything happens in the meetings. I think that's at the root of so much of our dysfunction.
And it must be painful because the other fact of the matter is that while short term, people might take some relief from that experience, long term, they're not attached to mattering work. They're not really helping colleagues to do better work. If they weren't there, they might not be as missed. And I think that starts to erode like confidence and belief in your own self, worth and ability.
I think so too. And we start to get in the habit of, performatively doing things at work rather than thinking about, okay, does this move work forward? And we're seeing something similar with AI as well, where it's often enough just to do the thing, just to roll out the tool, just to have a line item on your, budget for AI, rather than thinking about, okay, what is this in service of? And let's make sure that we're thinking about the outcome and not the process, as I think Jeff Bezos at Amazon used to use the phrase process as a proxy rather than, the actual work as a representation of what you're trying to achieve.
Interesting. Yeah, because so often I think in businesses I've always looked at that equation of like you have inputs and then you have your process and you have outputs. And so often I find that organizations index very heavily on one of them. Like, hey, how big are we on inputs? We've got all the best tools. Or how big are we on outputs, regardless of how we did them? And you see very different like cultures shape around that kind of viewpoint.
Yes. And outputs are tricky because we often associate or conflate outputs with outcomes.
Yes.
And thinking about, what are you incentivizing within your organization? Are you incentivizing the clicks of the tool or the lines of code or the number of blogs published, or are you incentivizing real business outcomes? And I think, again, that becomes even more important with AI, where, it's very easy to generate big outputs, big volume of content, big volume of code, whereas, thinking about the substance and does this actually move the business forward in a productive way?
I love the definition between outputs and outcomes. For leaders out there, is there a way that you can kind of help them think about looking at outcomes with their teams, whether it's in a meeting or in general with goal setting? Like how do you shift into that outcome mindset?
It needs to happen at the top. And I mean that both in the sense of leaders need to anchor on those outcomes, but also in terms of understanding what are the key outcomes, what are the business outcomes that we are trying to achieve as an organization.
Yeah.
Because then everything should be laddering up to those outcomes. And it becomes much easier if here are 3 to 5 North Star metrics, North Star outcomes as an organization. Every level should be then laddering up. And, often I've worked quite significantly in marketing departments throughout my career. There are areas in the organization where it becomes harder and harder to do that. But in every case, the more we're tethering our work to those business outcomes versus outputs, the more we're successful.
Brilliant. I love that. I really do. AI debt. Where does that take us?
Oh, there are so many dimensions of this. And I think we are truly just scratching the surface in terms of understanding AI debt and what it means. There's a security aspect of it where, we see so many organizations trying to bolt on security after the fact versus investing in tools and platforms that have security ingrained in the foundational level from day one. Agentic risk is very real, and I think we're going to unfortunately see, many examples of that come to fruition in terms of not thinking carefully enough about security from day one. There's also, the polish aspect where, we over time accumulate more and more divergence in terms of the original intent of work versus the reality. I think one of the biggest pieces of debt that probably most people, organizations haven't perhaps seen in a meaningful way yet, but I think will, is this leveling effect that happens when we all use AI to generate content in terms of being so generic, where you've now lost the voice and tone of your organization, yourself, your team, and you become more and more similar to others. We need to be very careful of that, I think. So there are multiple different dimensions. Another one is, the flattening. Flattening is the fad of the moment right now. We're seeing, and I see it every day, executives will come in and, they'll ask questions like, okay, how much should I be cutting my workforce right now? How many levels is the right level? And, those short-term fixes are very quickly going to come back to haunt organizations if we're not thinking about, okay, how do we also invest in early career talent and, build businesses that are going to be around for the enduring future? And recognize the unique potential of humans versus the machines.
That's actually a really interesting one. I mean, we've always had good data to show in tough times when you cut back on talent, you often overcut, and then it comes at a much greater cost to rebuild. So there's that kind of baseline thinking, but also I wonder with some of the AI slop coming in and that getting away from the original intent of work, leaders' jobs right now are probably harder than they've ever been on strategy, because you might have a board pushing you to have an AI strategy on, reduction in cost, but we've actually got to think about multiple futures that may be ahead of us and which people we need to bring through into those futures.
Yes, I don't for a second envy the CEOs or the CHROs right now of, these organizations, because I hear it every day. There is massive pressure. And, I go to a lot of these types of conferences where you have like-minded groups coming together, and, they'll come together and they'll share stories in terms of, what is the percentage that seems right now, given the evolution of the technology. And it's very dangerous to disassociate the outcomes or outputs from the strategy of an organization as well.
Yeah.
Every organization looks different. And going back to, clarity and purpose and mission, depending on how strong that is and how explicit that is to employees, how well versed they are in the mission and vision and outcomes of the business.
Yeah.
You can afford, in general, all else being equal, to cut more in those cases, because you have something that employees are anchoring on that in other organizations you might need more managers, more leaders to explicitly draw those links.
Yeah.
So it's, again, all about the system and understanding, okay, what are the pieces you're working with within your organizational culture, whether you can, afford to make some of these moves earlier rather than later.
Yeah, I love that, Rebecca. And what I'm hearing you say there, which is a theme I've seen in a few conversations, is that the culture work, which is traditionally deemed fluffier or event-based or socially driven, is becoming the hard work of right now, because it's the word you've used a few times today is it's system led. And right now in our systems, we're interjecting a whole bunch of new tech, which is moving so fast. Like the tech we're putting into our systems now won't be the same in 6 months, let alone 12 months.
No, I think it's so important. And when we think about the democratization of AI and, our products looking more and more similar, and, the models, everyone has the access to the same underlying foundational models.
Yeah.
It is going to be, the moat, the differentiation is going to come from the platform layer for sure, but also from culture, culture, human leadership within the organization, critical thinking. It's going to be the traditionally more soft skills that give organizations an advantage. And the more organizations can create the culture to extract, and I think one of the most important qualities in employees these days is being entrepreneurial and figuring out, okay, how does my role evolve alongside the technology? That is not something that's going to come from the organization. It's going to come in the best cases from employees who feel empowered to push the boundaries and have the space, both in terms of time and also the psychological space, to redesign their individual jobs.
Yeah. I like the redesign. There's been some conversation about career crafting or whatever you might want to call it. But when you call on that word entrepreneurial, obviously it means different things to different people. One of our former guests, Dr. Ernesto Ciroli, was talking to me about entrepreneurship, and his simple explanation of some of the roots of the word is it's the person who sees something before others. They comprehend it early. And I don't actually think that that's a competency or a behavior that organizations have traditionally been designed to celebrate, reward, enable.
Yes. And I think that's exactly spot on. And in theory, the person who is doing the job is going to be in the best position to identify, that next step and what people around them might not see, more so than anyone else in the organization.
Yeah. which takes some very different approaches to how you're engaging in conversations. And I wonder, coming back to AI, are you seeing any good use cases right now, whether it's in meetings or in the flow of work, otherwise, where AI is helping to maybe shine a light on some of those individual people or those themes that those individuals are seeing, experiencing at the fringes of organizations?
In terms of, the organization using AI to help with some of this.
Maybe the spotting of or the capturing
Yes.
of. Yeah.
I am in particular, I spend a lot of time with CHROs and HR leaders, and, the best ones are recognizing no one has this figured out. No one has the silver bullet, but they are starting to use the technology to assess, role overlap or, new roles that might be created within the organization. I was on a panel earlier this week where the individual had identified, I think 70% of tasks within the organization were overlapping with other tasks within other roles. And so massive overlap in terms of roles. And when we think about role design, in theory, AI allows us to become much more generalist in our skill sets. Mm-hmm. And so we should, in theory, have less and less overlap job to job. And I think we're seeing organizations think along those lines in terms of more individual contributors, more owners of end-to-end workflows. But even, I've seen it to the extent of organizations taking in multiple different data sets, both within the organization and outside the organization, mm-hmm. to start to make predictions about, okay, how exposed is this role to AI? And with the aim to be much more proactive about helping the employee think about, okay, if my role is heavily exposed to AI, how do I evolve it in light of the organizational priorities and the evolution of technology?
That's awesome. I've taken like 4 different points down there. I want to dive into it and make sure I keep room for it. But the first thing that I heard you say there was that the AI is able to map some of the tasks and those overlaps, which is fascinating. Is that something that the AI can do fairly naturally, or do you have to train the AI fairly heavily on, linking into different systems and this is how we do our work?
So it depends, but a lot of these, I first saw this type of analysis done about a year ago. One of our research partners at the Work AI Institute, Yong Lee at University of Notre Dame, he, with his colleagues, used AI to assess which roles within and which tasks are within the ONET job taxonomy, which is the Department of Labor job role task skill taxonomy, asking the AI, what is your degree of confidence that you can do this specific task and skill? Anthropic just published research last week, that's the same sort of analysis. And it's imperfect for many reasons, but it does give us a good sense of, okay, what is the level of exposure within these organizations? The limiting factor is none of these studies are really able to understand, okay, did it work? In theory, the AI could do this task, but was it successful within the organizational context? Because so much of our work is dependent on institutional knowledge and, the company context. So that becomes more and more important. And the more an AI platform understands how you work, how your organization works, the more it's able to make those determinations.
That's fascinating. Yeah, even things like taste and style matter there. Like I've worked with different FP&A leaders and they'll present a budget to me and I'm like, I hate this. Like it's formatted in a totally different way and I don't want to have to relearn how to look at my budget. And it's beautiful work. So it's like some of those human tendencies or preferences are always going to show up, aren't they?
Absolutely. And, that was the reason I was excited to join Glean, because they, the platform not only learns how the individual likes to work,
Yeah.
and whether they prefer the succinct bullet points or the flowery language or the charts versus the text to visual
Yeah.
ratio, because that matters. That matters for your success in upwards communication and downwards communication. But you also need to understand the organizational context and the culture of your organization. Some cultures are much more process oriented. Some are more prototype oriented. We're seeing this fascinating shift right now toward, prototyping over longer lead time workflows in a way that's very exciting, but also only works for certain organizational cultures.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for the organizations that are buried in bureaucracy and red tape. And so that, thinking about all levels of altitude in terms of, okay, how do we present this information in a way that's going to resonate and be accepted within the ecosystem?
That's very cool. Maybe one day AI will be able to take that budget file and be like, Dane likes it looking like this, and Rebecca likes it that way, and it'll take that one piece of work and personalize it to the delivery. Who knows?
Well, I mean, that's what Glean does, and it becomes very exciting to have the information tailored, because just as in meetings, I think there's so many parallels to meetings as well, where we often think first about what we need to say in the meeting, whereas it's much more important and effective to understand, okay, what do other people need to hear within the meeting? And we all are coming at work day to day with our own specific lens, our own specific metrics, our own priorities. And the more we can hyper-personalize using AI to those specific people, individuals, teams, the more we are successful in our functions.
That's very cool. Actually, that brings me back around onto meetings. One of your other points, you said there might be more individual contributors once you've got the generalist skills and the tooling. So that reminds me of like Lean Six Sigma and someone taking something all the way through. That sounds like it's a move away from teamwork. So how do you see in businesses that start to go there that people are going to be coming together for meetings or otherwise?
I think this is the biggest unknown. I am not sure. And I think it's very exciting because we are going to have, and we already do have, teams that are comprised of both humans and AI. But at the same time, we're going to have individuals who are owning more and more of the workflow and things that probably were one step removed from their core role previously. So I think, what I expect in the best case happens is we have AI platforms and tools that deeply understand every part of our organization, from the mission of the organization to the strategy, to the people, to the workflows, to the individual tasks, and dynamically assembles teams based on what are the priorities and how are they changing. So whereas previously we would have a project, we would look at the org chart and figure out, okay, who works with whom?
Yeah.
And we would staff those projects based on the very static org chart. You can imagine a world in which AI knows not only your skills, your capabilities, not only your past history of working together, not only your goals and your passions, not only your personality, all of those pieces, and dynamically assembles the right mix of people across your organization, and then disbands, a day or a week later, depending on the length of the project. That is my hope, because that is going to be much more effective for so many reasons, from outcomes and outputs to team morale and team learning amongst each other,
Customer
and also
experience,
for
the whole
customer
lot.
experience and the employee empowerment. It becomes much more fulfilling if your organization is also, at least in part, taking into account, okay, what motivates you? Who do you like to work with? What is your personality? And how do we staff you also on projects that you are going to learn from the people around you, and it's going to extract the best out of you?
That's super cool. It reminds me actually of a story. I was talking to a former member of IDEO, and IDEO kind of were already doing that in an analog kind of way. They shifted to more of from a regional model to a studio model, where they put these dynamic teams together based on those factors you're touching on.
Yes.
And it works. Like, teams love it. Customers get great outcomes, innovations through the roof.
Yeah. I think we underestimate in general how important morale and excitement and inspiration is, joy within our organizations. I have a piece in the book as well that talks about joy in meetings and how it's important to inject those moments of delight. It extracts the best out of people. And I think, we're perhaps not appreciating that enough as we, enter this era of hyper efficiency with AI.
I love that you've drawn attention to inspiration and joy, because they are the human fuels that the AI isn't going to be able to run on. It can be guided by and supported by it, but it's not going to find its own inspiration and joy anytime soon, from what I understand of the technology.
No, not without humans in the loop. I do think we can use AI to, figure out how do we inject more humanity into work, but it needs to come from the human, and the human absolutely needs to be, in the driver's seat in terms of making those decisions.
Love that. So as we're coming back then to the meetings that you've written about, the best meeting ever, and those that may be ahead of us, and you've got, say, a leader out there, a CHRO, a president, whatever it might be, and they've got these teams of people that are getting more and more individualized in their roles. What are you pointing people towards as they think about how they intentionally convene people to do work, and whether that's through meetings or otherwise? Like, what might sort of 1, 2, or 3 big focus areas be that people can just kind of land and start moving with?
I think, and this predates AI, certainly, it becomes easier with AI, but understanding those relationships within your organization is so important. And this is work I've done for at least 15 years in terms of, if you're able to map out who is collaborating with whom within your organization, you are in a much better position to understand, okay, how do we optimize for different factors? When I work with organizations, everyone is suffering from different types of problems, and looking for different types of opportunities, whether that is to improve collaboration or to improve velocity is a big one right now, or to develop resilience within our workforce. All of those aims can be tied back to the strength of how people work together. And it can be eye-opening to understand, your employees in Japan are not communicating at all with your employees in San Francisco, or the senior leaders are not communicating at all with, their skip level direct reports. We can understand so much about the health of our organization. I would argue everything from efficiency to innovation to employee empowerment, based on who's collaborating with whom.
That's fascinating. So that almost sounds like it's also telling us where the biases are. Hey, Japan's not working with San Francisco. There's bias somewhere in there because they prefer to work in this way. And,
absolutely.
And we can maybe structurally approach that.
Absolutely. And if you have a good sense of, okay, how should work happen and how are people collaborating, that's a clear way to see the bias as well, right? If you have the team who is physically co-located in the office collaborating overwhelmingly, whereas most of the work is actually happening cross-functionally, and those teams aren't collaborating as extensively, it gives you clear sort of insight that can then inform parts of the strategy. I've worked with organizations that, they'll do this type of analysis and then we'll say, okay, we should think more carefully about the physical layout of the office to try to drive certain outcomes. And obviously that's not feasible for every organization, but often there are tweaks that we can think about in terms of the physical office space to also encourage collaboration and drive some of these outcomes.
That's super cool. And outside of the meeting or the work, are there things that we should be socially doing so people don't feel as dependent upon that meeting debt and then showing up all the time?
Yes, we over-index way too much on meetings, and usually the problem is a broken communication system. So even starting with, do your employees have a clear rule, clear guidance in terms of what deserves to be a meeting in our organization?
Yeah.
Most employees do not. And it's such a simple thing for organizations to put in place in terms of, okay, what deserves to be an email? What deserves to be a Slack message? What deserves to be a meeting? What deserves to be an in-person meeting versus a remote meeting?
Yeah.
Most employees don't have that clarity. And, for the reasons we talked about at the very beginning, in particular, visibility bias and the process as a proxy, they're going to resort to meetings, which are the most expensive form of communication, right? Meetings are more expensive than any other form of communication. And if you don't have that clarity in terms of how the pieces work together, when you should communicate asynchronously versus synchronously, people are going to over-index on the meeting.
Very cool. So I like that, just creating the clarity, maybe the standard operating procedures to help them
Exactly.
there. And does it feel like if you're doing that and people aren't in as many meetings, that you actually get some time back to maybe do what could be truly social, even if that is a pub quiz on an app or whatever it might be?
100%. And, one of the questions I often get is, I talk a lot about meeting efficiency and the importance of meeting efficiency. And, people will often push back and say, well, I use meetings to establish connection with other people. And that can be an aim. But if you look at the research and the empirical evidence, we are much more effective at developing relationships with other people if we do it outside of a purely work setting.
Yes.
If we, go for the walk or bond over a shared interest or go out for a shared meal, which we know has, innate human bonding tendencies.
Yeah.
Those are much more effective aims. And if we do make our meetings more efficient, the goal should be to then leave more time to do the things in work and life that should not be highly efficient. And a big part of that is relationships with other people, motivating your team, inspiring your team, all the things, working with customers, spending more face time with customers, all the things that we know should not be highly, highly efficient.
Yeah, I love that. There was some research and work that a former guest, Leo Batari, was doing on peer innovation, which was his book, and he talked about groups beside teams. And there's a real power to having groups beside teams because they're not actually there to do work. They're there to talk about each other and maybe their experiences of work. And they become this like human connection engine and possibility engine to say, oh, maybe this is how you approach it. And it brings a lot of really good behaviors up.
Yes, I love that.
Super cool. We've covered some awesome territory. I feel like we're only really scratching the surface given everything that you're seeing and working on there, Rebecca. But this whole point about more isn't better and the visibility bias, I think, is huge. I think in teams we feel that meeting load, but actually knowing where it's coming from a little bit more psychologically is really cool. And coordination neglect, I'm going to spend a lot more time on that because I don't know if you've got any key tips in the book for that one, but it's definitely something I've been suffering from.
Yes, it's the literature is so fascinating, and I find myself, I have a colleague and mentor who I collaborate with a lot at Stanford, Bob Sutton, and we often go back to those early papers on coordination. And, there are various types of coordination in terms of there's sequential, there's reciprocal, and depending on the level of interdependence, your communication strategies ought to be different. And I think we can learn a lot from that research that is now decades and decades old.
That's super cool. I'm jealous you get to work with Bob as well because I've listened to it and read a bunch of his stuff. He's great. And then as we kept moving on from that, I loved how you framed the focus on outcomes, particularly for leaders over outputs and laddering down into organizations, creating that clarity. We came back to clarity a few times there, particularly around, clarity, purpose, mission, giving people the systems in which they can make their decisions. And I loved how that also framed the ability for team members to be more entrepreneurial in what they're bringing forward. But then this latter part of the conversation around, the overlap of tasks and org design potentially moving to more of an IC model and how we might need to be thinking differently about team design and more dynamic teaming. I think that's hugely fascinating. If it does bring the inspiration, the joy, the energy, that's a very positive outlook for us all to be holding towards how we could be working together.
I think so. And I think, I often say technology is not deterministic, right? It's not inherently good or bad. It's about how we enact it in our organization. And I'm both very excited about the potential of AI to improve teamwork for that reason, but also very nervous because if we're not putting that intentionality into how we think about team design, it's probably not going to work out for the best.
100%. Well, I've loved the conversation. For our listeners that want to find the book, Your Best Meeting Ever, or find you and work at the Work AI Institute or otherwise, where do they connect?
Sure. So the book is everywhere at your favorite local bookstore. My website's RebeccaHinds.com, and our Work AI Institute webpage is workai.institute.
Awesome. Well, congrats on the book, and thanks for leading all of this really interesting work.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you.
Just a quick note before we go. The views and opinions shared in this episode are those of our guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host, Dane Groeneveld, the Leader Group, our patron Huddle 3, or our partners and affiliates. Any scenarios discussed are for the purpose of fueling creative thinking and conversation, and should be viewed only in this context. Dane, Leader, our sponsors, partners, and affiliates do not endorse any guest or any organization they may be associated with. It's important to remember that every workplace is as individual as the people within it. Our recommendation is to always seek solutions that are specifically designed to help serve your team's unique needs. And to this point, please know we're here, ready to help you find the best way forward, no matter where your starting point is. You can connect with Dane or myself, Alicia McCraw, on LinkedIn or via the links contained in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in. And hey, if you think someone in your network would benefit from this episode, feel free to share it or give us a 5-star rating. Those 5 little stars really help us reach more curious people like you. We'll catch you next time on The Future of Teamwork.